Good morning, everyone. And I say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are on our beautiful planet. Thank you for joining us on our webinar today, which is in relation to the relationship between ESG and the company value. I won't go into details about what the webinar is. You would have read a little bit about it in the print, but let me just share some background about our three very excellent speakers. First, we have Akiva Bonik, who is an environmental and social manager at Berkeley Energy, very passionate and excited about ESG. More importantly, Akiva brings with her a very special background, having worked and lived in Central and South America to Africa and Southeast Asia. So she's actually worked in communities where ESG is a very important topic. Then we have Ipshita Chaturvedi. Ipshita is a partner in Denton's Rodike, the corporate practice, as well as co-heading the ESG practice. She's over 12 years experience in the environmental law and natural resources practice, and she's very well versed in legal regulatory issues. Then we have Paul Davis, who's head of strategy of Everidge. Paul brings with him a wealth of experience in helping companies to identify, to manage, to value, and to monetize their intangible assets. As you can imagine, ESG is a very important intangible asset, and Paul has been working with companies to unlock this value. Just some simple housekeeping rules. The webinar will run for 60 minutes. The speakers will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, not at the end of each presentation. If you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function. Type in your questions and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar presentations. All right. With that, I'm going to start the webinar. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I would like to ask Akiva to start us off. Akiva, over to you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Happy to be part of this webinar, and I hope you all can hear me okay. So let's get started. So I will give a short introduction about me and Berkeley Energy, my organization, and then I will talk about the business case, focusing on 4 points with some examples. Then I'll move on to where to begin with your journey on ESG if you're just starting out, also giving focusing on 4 points with some examples. So my name is Akiva Bonik, and I am the ESG manager at Berkeley Energy. Berkeley is a private equity firm that invests and develops renewable energy projects across Africa and Asia. I have been with Berkeley for the last 8 years, building their ESG capabilities in-house. And there's more about me here, and you can read that later. Okay, so why ESG? So the first point is access to international financing. So if you are an international player and seeking financing, then this is certainly important. An example I can give pertains to BE and our fundraising. ESG is a key pillar in our fundraising. We highlight our in-house ESG team, our experience over a number of years integrating ESG into complex projects, and importantly, our programs that positively impact the local community. And we have been successful in our fundraising endeavors across both regions. ESG trends. You want to be current in the market and have an understanding what can have an impact on your organization now and in the future. And if you have good ESG people on board, you will not be surprised. And you will be able to accommodate for changes. So an example I'll give is Berkeley and climate change. So a company like Berkeley is already contributing positively towards renewable energy through their projects. However, due to the pandemic, COP26 conference last year, net zero is a trend that is being pushed aggressively, at least I believe. And we, fortunately, we've already been aware of this about 2 to 3 years prior and already looking at it. And so by the time our investors brought it up, we weren't surprised. And we are currently working on this. Increased revenue, reduced cost. So I think this is an obvious one. If there is energy efficiency or efficiency with using natural resources, then there will be reduced cost. Or if you can monetize your waste material, then you'll have a good revenue stream. I won't spend too much time on this because I think this is pretty clear. Improved brand value. So this is very important. Reputation plays an important part when discussing brand value. So one can build a positive reputation through ESG, but it can also be eroded if you have bad ESG practices or deceiving your stakeholders on your ESG practices. And this is what you call greenwashing. So an example I can give where an energy project reputation was eroded. So this project was carrying out some earth movement, sediment was carried downhill to the nearby water body, and this impacted the local community's ability to fish, bathe, wash clothes, etc. The project was told to make some improvements. Basically, they needed to stop this from happening. So they put in some measures, but it wasn't enough, and they also knew this. So eventually the authorities got involved, there was a stop order, there was a fine, and that was a huge cost for them. But I believe the greatest impact to the company was their reputation. So because of this, other projects that they wanted to construct in the area was impeded, and so they didn't have the social license to operate. So now I will move on to where to begin if you are starting out. Commitment. For me, this is the most important part when implementing ESG. The commitment from top management, your CEO, your C-suite, whatever you want to call them, is very important. It allows for initiatives to be driven from the top, more buy-in, more authority to the person responsible for ESG, and changes can be faster. So an example I can give is associated with a project hiring an ESG manager because it was part of the requirements in the agreement between investors and the project. So top management didn't really care much about ESG. They thought it was a burden, they thought it was a cost. This manager tried to drive change, but was pushed to the side. Eventually, this person left after a short while. This didn't look good for the company and could potentially be default if they couldn't find a new E&S manager quickly. So that wasn't very good for them. Focus. So like anything you're doing, you need to focus. You have to prioritize. And that also applies to ESG. If you try to do everything that might not be important for your organization, it becomes too complicated. A construction company might need to focus more on migrant laborers, while, I don't know, an online bank may need to focus more on, say, governance, fraud, board composition. So I remember when I was developing the ESMS for my organization, so all our investors wanted whatever was important to them to be included in our ESMS. And this just wasn't possible. So we had to have many discussions on how we could focus and improve. And then this leads me to my next point, interval steps. So I will say this, ESG is not a race. Whichever company claims to be the best sustainable company in no time, I guarantee they're greenwashing. It's okay to take some time and to take steps. You just have to explain that and justify that. If you are looking for short-term gains, then this is not the journey for your organization. Yes, you may achieve some low-hanging fruits, but the real impact will be long-term impact. So develop your, 3 to 5 year plan to achieve some aspects. And, it could take longer. And finally, develop your ESMS. So for those who don't know what an ESMS is, it is an ENS management system. It has a set of processes and procedures that allows an organization to manage ESG impacts of its operations. It's just putting down on paper how you will manage your ESG risks, impacts, and being able to track how you're doing. It must fit the business, and it should follow the plan, do, check, act model. There are lots of trainings on this online, so if you're interested in that. Importantly, you should get the right person with the right ESG skills to lead this process. And this can be in-house, it could be through a consultancy firm, or a combination of both. So that's it, folks. We spoke about the business case of ESG. We touched on access to international financing, ESG trends, increased revenue, reduce costs, and improve brand value. And then we went over how to begin your ESG journey, and we touched on getting commitment from top management, focusing on what's important, taking interval steps, and developing your ESMS. And I hope this was useful, and happy to take questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you. So back to you. Let me.
Thank you, Akiba. I'm now going to introduce Ipshita. She's going to present her slides and her presentation. Ipshita, over to you.
Thank you, Sivi, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's dialed in. A big thank you to Everidge, my firm, Dentons Rodike. Sivi, our wonderful moderator, is actually sitting in the next room. And Akiva for presenting really the most crucial piece of the conversation, which is an actual working example of how ESG manifests in practice. The purpose of my next 10-12 minutes is really to deconstruct ESG as a concept into bite-sized pieces of what this really looks like for companies every day. So with that, I begin. So what really is ESG for the purposes of law, regulation, reporting, and your actual day-to-day? The E is environmental factors, or the environment. This is the portion really which considers how a company performs in terms of caring for the physical environment. So the number one teller of this performance is how is a company helping in lowering the energy that it uses, in offsetting some of the carbon that it generates, and generally what is it doing towards bringing down global warming by bringing down greenhouse gas emissions. So what is this entire process of reducing the reliance on carbon or carbon intensity? Mainly, this applies to electricity generation and the power sector. You will have heard words like net zero, decarbonization, path to zero carbon, carbon negative. So really being net zero basically means balancing negative emissions by removing emissions from the atmosphere to achieve carbon neutrality. I like to always imagine a sink being filled up with water, but there's a danger that the water is going to overflow very soon if it hasn't already. So how do we sort of resolve this? We can either turn off the tap, which is emissions reductions, or remove the plug and drain some of the water out. That would be your carbon mitigation measures, offsets, sequestration, etc. Decarbonization is the plan to not let water overflow, and net zero is the equivalent of making sure that the amount of water coming from the tap is equal to that being drained out of the plug hole. So carbon tax, emissions trading, etc. comes under net zero and decarbonization. So what does it mean legally? Legally, this translates into policies, it translates into regulation, strategies, and projects that will need to be developed and implemented by the private sector going forward. Now, even though it's not as popular as carbon, the next big ESG issue is going to be water, undoubtedly. It means that companies focusing on making water-intensive processes more efficient and figuring out ways to put water back into an area where a company operates than it takes out is becoming a focus, particularly because water shortages are a very near possibility. Current predictions by most international organizations say that there's going to be a 40% shortfall in fresh water by 2030. So companies who basically are going to be jumping on solutions to figure out water alternatives would become more valuable than companies who don't. As an example, BP, Facebook, Gap have all been making recent pledges to become water positive in the coming decades, which means they're going to replenish more water that used in their direct operations. For the textile sector, for example, water is very relevant, and Ralph Lauren and Dow are also looking at new dye processes that make wastewater treatment less energy intensive. And in fact, last year, PepsiCo as well announced a plan that includes replenishing more than 100% water used at all high-risk water sites by 2030. So whenever a company makes a reporting like that or makes a claim, you back up the claim with your processes, which is either based in regulation or voluntary frameworks. All of that becomes the E of the ESG. Some of the sectors to look out for are really from the ocean side. You would be hearing the words blue economy. That ticks off the E as well. Some examples are recycling single-use plastics, alternative low sulfur fuels, solar shipping, ballast water treatment systems, etc. Biodiversity is relevant to FMCG, cosmetics, life sciences, biotechnology. Anyone who basically uses biogenetic resources would have biodiversity as one of the E's in their processes. It is a harder nut to crack than the rest because it is extremely difficult to quantify, but it's definitely an area to watch out for in the coming future. The S piece of ESG stands for society. Basically, what impacts does a business have on the local communities in which it operates? So what sort of positive or negative impact do you have on labor, on human rights, and how as a business do you deal with them, particularly in your supply chains? We're seeing more and more clients being impacted by supply chain related issues, forced labor allegations, allegations of child labor. The Rana Plaza fire in Bangladesh is a very good example of that. So that's the S. And the G really is the governance piece, which is your anti-corruption and bribery, diversity, inclusion, and transparency and reporting that a company does within itself. This entire thing forms the gamut of what ESG means for companies. Next, we will go to the three main drivers of ESG. Fantastic, thanks. So what is it that's really driving ESG in the market? Regulation is one. So when we are talking about ESG, we must also remember that every conversation about ESG is very specific to two things: the sector in which your company operates, and the jurisdiction in which your company is based. If your company is in a high risk sector like the power sector or oil and gas sector, then ESG takes a different meaning than if your company is in a low risk sector in a developing economy. Even so, ESG will impact you, and here's how. So the first driver of ESG is just regulation. Most of the regulations are really in the investment space and the securities markets area. Most of the new laws that are coming are basically related to climate risk related disclosures and also supply chain related regulations. Let me give you some examples. There's the EU taxonomy law. There's the sustainable finance disclosure requirements in the EU. MAS in Singapore is issuing more and more climate related disclosures on companies. ASEAN is coming up with its own taxonomy. The SEC in the US has several such parameters as well. So while there is a lot of drive in the investment space, and while most of this is on climate change, the penalties still for non-compliance are pretty high. Greenwashing is also a risk that Akiva spoke about. So if obviously you are in those jurisdictions, then ESG parameters directly impact you. The biggest example is carbon markets. If by law you are required to decrease your reliance on fossil fuels and you have to be sourcing energy from renewable sources, that becomes a mandatory ESG compliance for you. The other, so finance is really something that Akiva spoke about, just accessing finance, accessing green finance, and accessing investors. If you are not an ESG company, you're going to have trouble accessing those funds simply because those funds themselves have regulations on how they need to do this. But it can also be industry-led in the sense that when a company has mandatory laws on themselves, they are going to transfer some of those laws to the companies that they are dealing with. You could be a supplier, you could be just a partner with the company, you could be a project implementer. The minute that happens, the company on which there are mandatory laws or voluntary actions that they have decided they will take, they will put ESG clauses in your contracts, which puts you at massive risk if you do not understand what that ESG clause really means for your business. So more about this, I think, in the Q&A. Could we have the next slide, please? Just to give you a practical example of what we as lawyers and a law firm do in this space, and really, so we start with helping a company charter its ESG journey, depending on the sector and the jurisdiction that they are based in. We see what their needs are, where they're at. So we do a heat mapping analysis. We have a two-tier system within our firm, global and regional as well as local, so that everything is well harmonized. And then we kind of just harmonize within an MNC as well, the different BUs, so procurement teams, legal teams, and also sustainability reporting. That's becoming a very key issue in the legal side of things. Are you able to back up what you claim you are doing? Akiva mentioned most of the companies greenwashing. We see more and more litigation against companies that are claiming things and they cannot back it up. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Paul, who is going to take us really into detail about how the valuation truly works. And over to you, Sivi.
Thanks, Aja. I'm going to hand it over to Paul immediately. All to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sivi. Let me share my screen. Let me try that again. Is that sharing the correct screen, Sivi? Can you please just confirm?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, let me start by very briefly introducing Everedge. This will only take a second. So Everedge is a management consultancy that specializes in intangible assets. And what we seek to do is help and work with companies to help them identify the intangible assets within their business, assess those assets, how do they operate within the business, strategize around them. How can you do this better? Which assets might you put more capital into to try and increase them? Which ones are going to have the greatest impact on your business? Value them. Critically, it comes down to value, and then potentially unlock that value where we see assets that may be underutilized. Now, what's the relevance between intangible assets and ESG? I know, this is titled The Relationship Between ESG and Company Value. And part of it is in response to the number of companies that have said to me, well, what does this really do for our company value? Akiva spoke around commitment. And if the board and the senior management are going to be committed to this, they also have some responsibility to their shareholders as well. I mean, companies were largely driven for shareholder benefit previously, and that has taken a broader context now with stakeholders being considered and more than just shareholder value being considered. But in either way, this still has to come down to, it at least has to be a factor. What does this mean in terms of value? So let's break down what company value really is. Enterprise value. It's the current value of the future cash flows generated by the company. That's really where enterprise value comes from in a numbers context. And if you have an enterprise value, you can break that down to say, well, our tangible assets on our balance sheet are X, cash in the bank is Y, and the difference between the sum of those and our enterprise value must attach to something, and it attaches to intangible assets. ESG is not an asset on its own. ESG is a philosophy. ESG is a practice and a policy, and it's broad. It's not one thing. As Abhishek already outlined, there are any number of different initiatives that may come under this ESG heading. So it's not like you're going to have something on your balance sheet that says ESG value equals X. And if the audience were hoping I would have a magic formula that translates any ESG initiative into a dollar value, no, it's not that simple. Every initiative has its own value. Some of the elements may have direct value. So that's much easier for you to account for. If someone hands senior management a proposal and it generates carbon credits, which are driven by regulation, you know what the penalty is if you don't achieve your whatever the regulations are setting for your carbon levels. If it's a waste to energy initiative and you know what the value of that byproduct line may be, then you have direct values you can put in. They are not difficult because they are around the initiative and you can value them according to what the value of those particular products are at the time. So projects may have their own economic value, but what about the ones that either don't, or the ROI is insufficient on those to justify them purely on their economic value alone? To what extent should you take an initiative purely because it has ESG credentials as well? And that's where it gets more difficult. So again, looking at these components of enterprise value, typically you'll start off with your fixed assets and cash. And generally, when you're talking about an enterprise value, there's also some multiplier on the cash flow. If you were doing a very simple, back of the envelope valuation of a company, there is often a mechanistic value around a multiple of EBITDA or some other mechanism by which you can say, so our enterprise value is something like this. Strategic value is the interesting piece. Now, strategic value is something that moves your value beyond that simple mechanistic approach and is often done in the context of to whom do the assets belong. So if you are a small company, you have a great innovation perhaps, there is a limit as to how far you can actually enter the market with it and how much cash you can make. A bigger player may be able to make an awful lot more money from bringing that same initiative into their company and expanding it across a bigger consumer base. This is all understood, and that's where acquisitions drive. ESG sits in that strategic value space, but it has direct impact on cash flows as well. Like all of these things, intangible assets have risks as well. And to the extent that ESG impacts on intangible assets, they can also carry risk. So I'm talking about intangible assets. If ESG initiatives can add value, and either ignoring or just subtracting the value it may have to your tangible asset base. If you buy a plantation or a block of trees, they may have a particular value. I'm not talking about that value. I'm saying, well, what does the ESG component add? Generally, there are a limit of the things that it can attach to. It doesn't necessarily attach to your tangible assets. The value add has to attach somewhere into those cash flows to actually be of real value. One of the ways it can do so, and I largely ignore that for the sake of this presentation because I've only got 12 minutes, is impact on internal team culture. People may feel happier working for a company with good ESG credentials. That may lower your cost of labor, may lower your staff churn, and we can talk about how staff churn actually attaches to intangible assets. So good governance is in there as well. Good governance can create job magnets. Job magnets, companies people want to work for. Again, lower churn, lower cost of labor. They may be willing to work for less, work harder, work happier. Their efficiency may improve. Those elements are actually hard to price in because they are not unrelated from each other. So a good management team, good governance, good labor practices, all add into this internal culture. And that's a difficult thing to price. You see it as much in past performance as you do in future performance. So to some extent, it is already built into the growth of the company and its numbers on past performance. But there are some that are not. So if you take away the ones where the initiative itself may add to some of these specific asset classes, but where do the ESG credentials lie? They principally lie into two classes, approvals and certifications. So this is the regulatory framework under which you operate. And Ipshita already mentioned this, that there may be a price to play in a particular market. If you want to go into particular markets and you require a certain approval or you need to meet a certain standard, whether that's ESG or some other standard, there is a cost to that. These are real barriers to entry for competition. If they are barriers to entry for competition and they are a direct cost to play in that industry, then they act as an intangible asset of the business. Having achieved it, you have something of value that a new entrant would not. So some of it relates to that, and particularly where there's direct regulation around it. And as Akiva mentioned, the other big asset class that this relates to is brand. And brand has two sides. So brand is both a positive, but then making some error in market and getting bad press can actually reduce your brand value. So risk comes into it as well. But brand is a critical asset class. It is one of the largest intangible asset classes. But again, how do you value brand and how does ESG relate to it? So brand value is really an indication of market position or dominance. It says, look, our brand can carry us into this position. Everyone knows it. It's not directly related to market share because it may be a premium. Maybe you are not taking all the market share you could, you're charging more for your products or services instead. It still has a direct value and that can be accounted for. But it must be market facing. If you're doing something wonderful in terms of ESG, but you don't tell the market at all that you are doing so, then the market is not going to price that into their purchasing decisions. It's not going to add value to your brand. It may if you tell investors, but I'll get onto investment later. But really, if you want to see a positive impact in terms of your actual value, then it has to come into purchasers' decisions around your goods and services. And brand can be calculated. So you can calculate brand against the value of a generic brand in the same market. You can say, well, no, we're able to charge $1 more for our product or services because it comes from us. It has a real value. But in doing this, in making the decision on whether to pursue an ESG initiative, you have to speculate on the impact this may have on your market to determine whether it's really going to drive this brand value or not. But there are plenty of proxies for this. So if you look at organic produce labeling, sustainably produced commodities such as sustainably caught fish, for example, all of these have a real price point in the market. They are already priced in. They've been around for a long time. There's plenty of data on them. And these things have real value. They can show that through the response of the market. Whatever the initiative is, you've got to work out, well, how am I going to translate that and tell the market about it? And what's that going to do to my potential to price myself in the market or take market share? But it doesn't work equally across all types of businesses. So industry type comes into this. There may be, if you are in a particular market where purchases, particularly where it's more discretionary, they may be more influenced by such factors. You may decide to go to a particular coffee shop because they use sustainably sourced beans in their coffee production. Is the company market facing? If it's not, if you are in the supply chain, then unless your ESG credentials are getting passed on so they can be used by the company that is market facing, it's difficult to see the real value in it. How well does the marketing team actually leverage the position? Are they making the statements? Is there any objective standard or endorsement that may have greater recognition? So the ability to put a label on your product that says, that goes beyond the greenwashing that was mentioned earlier, that no, we have achieved this particular standard and that is understood, that is going to add more in terms of market impact and hence brand value. Then we get onto the question of risk. So risk is the opposite side of all the positive benefits of value. And risk is a difficult thing for markets to value. Particularly, it will relate to the governance aspect of ESG, but also the social in terms of labor practices. Outside public markets and publicly traded stocks, risk is not well priced by many markets. Private investors will often value according to the numbers of a business and use risk as a no or no-go on their decision on whether to invest. So it's not a question of, well, we're still going to give you the money, but we're going to charge you more for it. Sometimes it's we're not going to invest. You're outside our risk profile because of poor governance, poor labor practices, something that comes under this heading. And a lot of risk is accommodated into warranties or indemnities upon investment or upon acquisition. So even though a seller may have divested from their company, there may still be an indemnity over them carrying real liability for them against risks in the business. And if they do not have good governance, then the likelihood of that risk increases. So there is a very real value to this. There may also be internal impacts, as I said before. So the internal impacts, such as employee churn, not only have a direct impact on the business in terms of you're having to employ people and get them up to speed, but it has real risks to other intangible asset classes. Your confidential information, your industry expertise, these types of classes are at most risk when you have a high staff turnover when everyone is going to the competition. So let me cover the investment piece last. ESG and investment. It's already been mentioned. There are ESG specific funds where they put a high standard on the ESG component. And the law of supply and demand says that if you are unable to source funds from a segment of the market and you're in a more restricted supply, then you may have to pay a little bit more. So there is a real cost on the investment side by excluding yourself from those ESG funds because your credentials don't match. If you look at the performance of ESG funds in the market, they have actually overperformed compared to all funds. But it's less clear as to whether this is because ESG funds themselves, the nature of them has directed them to certain industries and away perhaps from the resource sectors, and those industries have overperformed over the resource industries in recent times. So how much of the overperformance is down to the self-selection of ESG funds into industry types compared to going for businesses within an industry that have greater ESG credentials? I haven't seen the data to be conclusive on that. Obviously, there's also compliance requirements for ESG funds. So these relate to being able to meet those particular standards. There is a real cost to that. And but it increases the potential market for investment. So you have to try and trade those two. And it may not translate to all industries. So again, you know, does a cleaner oil and gas company really open themselves up to the ESG funds? Perhaps not. The standards may not be suitable for them. Governance. As I said, governance is more likely to impact their direct decision to invest or not, or come through in warranties and liabilities, but may not affect the value in terms of the enterprise value someone is arguing about. But if it precludes you from an investment and a bidder drops out, you have to turn down to the next bidder. So it does have a direct value as well. So overall, look, ESG, the biggest positive impact on company value is probably through brand, but it does depend on where you sit within that framework. But there are real risks in here as well, and particularly around this investment side. Good governance does open you up to greater investment, greater values. You can get the higher bidder because they are not precluded because you're not meeting a standard available. So they were the message I wanted to give. I will now pass back to Sivi, and Sivi can run a Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that presentation. Very interesting. I would now ask the presenters to sort of unmute and show themselves as we go through some very interesting questions which have been raised. Maybe the first one I'll start is for Ipshita. For a medical diagnostic company developing products to help with the allocation of health resources in developing countries, which aspects of ESG do you think apply?
That's actually a great question. I would say two, depending on what product your company is manufacturing and which part of the supply chain you're in. So it could actually be the S piece if you are providing access to medicines for vulnerable communities in developing countries. That's a massive case for an S. So for you, the S would be bigger. However, if you're a big company that's procuring a lot of equipment, then depending on the nature of the equipment, it could also be the E piece. On mining, then, like how are you sourcing your equipment? Are there rare earth minerals, or are there any conflict minerals, etc.? So it really depends on how big your business is, what exactly you're manufacturing, and at what point of the supply chain you're in.
Thanks, Ipshita. And maybe taking that point about, you know, the size of the company, Paul, a question for you. And do you believe that big companies operating in small developing countries are less concerned about ESG and brand impact, or do you think they are more concerned?
I actually suspect they are more concerned. It depends on what you mean by operating in small countries. If they are solely operating in small countries, remember that a lot of this comes down to the market itself. And so if a large company is operating in a small market, particularly a developing markets, the consumer may have less choice and may be less concerned with the ESG credentials themselves, but their home market may indeed be worried. So does having very bad ESG credentials in terms of what you're doing in a smaller market overseas impact on the consumers back home? Yes, indeed it can. And that's where that brand value can get seriously hurt through operations that themselves may not be of significant value themselves. It might be a small percentage of their revenues, and yet it's having a bigger impact in their home market where they have much larger revenues.
And Paul, while you're on this topic, one of the questions which came was about your suggestion about 85% of the headline metric, which is intangible assets. And the question specifically was, what percentage of that 85% do you think is ESG related compared to the rest of the intangible assets?
Well, as I said, ESG is not within the matrix of intangible assets itself. It impacts on those intangible assets. So, some of them may get added in, but they are project specific. But generally, the ESG credentials will come into approvals and certifications and impact other factors. So things like your labor, as I said, your labor practices may increase. If they're poor, they may increase your employee churn, which puts your confidential information more at risk. You've got more people going from your firm to the competitors and taking that information with them. So it's actually the impact on the others, on the separate classes. You can't separate it out in percentage terms. Every business is specific on this. But if you're going to manage all the asset classes well, then obviously you have to take ESG into account on the way.
Sure, thank you. Akiba, probably a question that you are best placed to answer is, how important is it for a corporate entity or company to be credentialed with and monitored for ongoing audit purposes by a valid third-party standards or a service provider? I guess it's like an ISO certification, if there is any.
I think it's useful to have because what that does is speaks the language of people out there who may not understand ESG in detail. So having this accreditation does help, and being audited always will look good for your organization. So I do think there is value in it, but only if you are actually implementing ESG. The accreditation is just something to help to showcase what you're doing. So there is value.
Yeah, but on that issue, I mean, I have a thought here, which maybe you and Ipshita and Paul might understand, and that is the harmonization of ESG regulations is not the same across all regions. It differs. Some countries want more, some countries are a bit less. So if you're operating, from a developed country operating in a developing nation or vice versa, how do you actually work around these rules and non-harmonized kind of regulations? It's a bit difficult. How would you advise? And I'll leave it to Ipshita, you and Paul to answer in any way.
Should I go first, considering
Yeah, fine.
this is what we kind of do all the time, harmonization. So Sivi, actually that's a great point. And so certification is a good example. There could be some certifications that are acceptable or rather accepted around the world, like for example GRI, or for banks it could be TCFD, SASB. Those are some of the common big certifications. And there was a question about how important those certifications are. We have actually advised small niche companies that do not have any certifications and do not need certifications either, because their disclosures are at a level where they do not need a third party to come and tell them how sustainable they are. And that's also okay. Because ESG laws can never be harmonized around, because the birth of international environmental law divides the world into two: those with historic responsibility for climate change and those that are not responsible. So having a common ESG standard would actually never be allowed, because developing countries are never going to say yes to that. So the harmonization typically happens through contracts, through due diligence, where the company with mandatory laws would have complex due diligence systems on the company that it's investing in or procuring from. Or it could also just be based on the disclosures or questionnaires or supplier codes of conduct, etc., that companies in developing countries are signing. So the risk for them is to not sign it without understanding what this means and entails for them. That's a risk for the developing country company. But the harmonization typically happens through contracts, codes of conduct, disclosures, and diligence.
Akiva or Paul, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just add, and I'm not entirely disagreeing with you, Upshita, but I would never take never as absolute. Of course, I come from an intellectual property background originally, and you had that same contrast between countries that were trying to develop technology and didn't want to follow IP practices and didn't want IP implemented, strict IP regimes, dictating that, you know, the overseas rights owner can come and dictate in their country. And we still have that going on today. And yet large portions of that have been harmonized principally through trade agreements. So being a member of the WTO requires you to have certain IP laws in place. And I can see the same happening with ESG. It's just much earlier in its evolution. So never in terms of immediate business plan. Absolutely agree with you, Upshita. Never in terms of forever. No, it will balance out over time. But it requires those commitments at an international trade level to actually drive it. In terms of businesses, look, it comes down to their business plan. If I thought not meeting a standard precluded me from a large market segment and I had big aspirations, then obviously I'm going to have to comply with it. If I go, look, the European standard is higher, I have to make a decision as a business as to whether Europe is an important market to me. If I think it is in my future, then I'm going to have to meet that standard. And so it really does come down to the business plan itself.
Sure. Thanks, Paula. Yeah. Akiva, I just wanted to ask you one question which has come in here, and is, what are your thoughts on the quality of, and not quantity, but the quality of measurement of the ESG elements and the ability to show this quality in consideration with greenwashing? Because you would have seen this in the financing aspects of your businesses.
Right. So, I mean, good question, broad question. So it is very important in terms of the quality. I think a lot of what we do in the space of ESG is about quality and the impacts and how is it really looking at change and your risk and all of that. So you know, in the space of greenwashing, it's a difficult one as well, because greenwashing is such a term that it's not necessarily defined, but you know what it is. And you know that when organizations are trying to trick you then in what they're doing. And so that is where you're going to see through the quality of what they produce, how they're producing. You know, you have to look at who are they using to carry out the work. That all plays a part in understanding what is happening and if they really mean what they're meaning, you know. Yeah. So you're looking at a whole variety of different things.
Sure. Okay, great. Yeah. I just had a question on this element of reputation, which Akiva, you mentioned, Paul talked about this, and that is having a good ESG practice, I think, is a very good intangible asset, although Paul does say it's not an asset, but it's an impact. And our whole webinar today is about the relationship between ESG and company value. Now, if you have good ESG practices, it improves your reputation. You can't put a dollar value on it, but surely it must have an impact either qualitatively on the E, the S, and the G aspects of your business. With that in mind, I guess the obvious answer is you must have some good ESG practice to improve your reputation and all the things that go with it. And you risk more if you don't have any of this. Would that be an accurate summary of things? And even if you do, is there a quantitative aspect that we can put a dollar value to it?
Yeah, look, I think that's where the argument is. I think you can put a real dollar value on it. Look, there is no hard metric around this. You can't say, look, it's always worth $1.50 or something. It doesn't work that way. You have to look at each one in context. But the reality is that reputation is directly attached to brand. And if you have a good brand and you have good practices, purchasers are happier to buy your product. So they will either pay more for it, or they will be, or if it's same price, they will choose yours over another. So it has a very real impact on your revenues. As I said, the hard bit is in deciding whether to pursue an ESG initiative. You have to work out how much that's going to be worth in the future, rather than being able to determine it from what already exists. And that's where the proxies I bring up, such as, you know, the organic produce or sustainably produced, or there are different ones where the market has already largely priced those in, and you can use those proxies to get a guide as to what value it may actually attribute to your products. But yes, look, there's always some element of speculation in deciding that, but then there is an evaluation.
Sure. Ipshita, Akiva, anything to add to that?
Legally, Sivi, I would say that the risk, again, depending on where they are at, if you have mandatory laws, then the risk is, of course, of legal non-compliance and therefore applicable penalties. But I think that the risk is really bigger if you say you're doing something that you're not. So I think the not doing something is probably better at this point than greenwashing badly. And as Akiva said, there's no need to do everything in one go and become completely clean overnight. Taking baby steps and even making a small plan, even making a plan for a plan in the right direction is, I would say, less risky than committing all sorts of things and then not being able to back it up. And legally, that risk is a lot higher, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's also where, and talking about the standards, where there are initiatives where there is some kind of objective standard actually helps. Now, whether that's through regulation that you meet a particular standard, or regulation on the ability to label a product. So there's regulations around using certain terms in relation to products, but also third-party standards. So being able to put the label of an independent party that says, yes, this really does meet this standard. Those endorsements carry more weight from a brand context than simply saying you're doing something in this area, because yeah, that greenwashing question is how much of it is real. Objective standards and third-party standards. So certification trademarks matter.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We've come to the end. We've just gone slightly above the hour, but it just shows how much interest has been generated in this topic. It just leaves me to thank Ipshita, Akiva, and Paul for excellent presentations and responding to the questions.